My name is Lucinda, and if someone had ever told me I'd dare tell the truth about my family out loud, I probably would have laughed, that bitter, dry laugh that escapes when there's no strength or reason left to maintain a facade. But perhaps at a certain age, a woman begins to feel a persistent need to finally call a spade, to remove that old, threadbare blanket of silence and say everything as it was, without embellishment. I have parents and an older sister, Maya, and my entire childhood is a long, drawn-out series of scenes where I stand by the sidelines, watching as life, gifts, attention, words of praise, and even basic warmth are bestowed upon her, as if by some invisible law, leaving me with only crumbs. From the moment I began to understand words and their meaning, I understood one thing: I was not the favorite. My parents didn't even try to hide it. It never occurred to them that such a thing wasn't right for a child. Maya is our special girl, my mother would drawl, smoothing her hair, while I stood nearby like furniture, like a backdrop, colorless and soundless. Maya got everything first: the best toys, the newest things, the best words, the best looks. When the latest iPhone came out, guess who held it first? Of course, it was Maya. When designer jeans suddenly became the fashion of the season, Maya had 3 pairs, blue, gray, and white, and I, as usual, would pull her old ones out of the closet, stretched out and smelling of someone else's shampoo. "We spent our entire budget on your sister," my mother would say, "and these still fit you. Besides, these clothes are just wonderful." These words became the password of my childhood. Everything about me was just wonderful, old, worn, tattered, but wonderful. And before we continue, I want to thank you. I am so glad that you are watching this video on my channel. Please write in the comments if you remember someone from your life when you listen to such stories, maybe yourself, maybe someone close, or just a moment when everything suddenly changed. Write down the first thing that came to your mind. The worst were the holidays. Christmas and birthdays turned into a performance, with Maya playing the princess and me an unnoticed extra. Under the tree, boxes of expensive jewelry, new gadgets, and perfume in gold packaging were piled high for her, while for me, there were a few trinkets from the clearance section. Whenever I dared to protest, my mother would sigh, "You need to learn to value money, Lucinda. We want you to grow up smart." Then she'd add, more gently, "And Maya needs it for her advanced studies." By 15, I'd stopped asking for anything. Why humiliate myself if the result was always the same? I got a job at a grocery store, lied about my age. I just wanted some money of my own, some air of my own. I stacked apples and muffins on the shelves, stood at the checkout until my fingers ached with fatigue, and dreamed of one day buying myself something new. But even then, my parents found a way to take that away. "Maya needs her textbooks," my mother would say, counting my paycheck. "We're teaching you family loyalty." It's funny, but in all those years, I never saw Maya sacrifice anything for her family. That was always my role: to give, to endure, to wait. When Maya graduated from high school, her parents paid for her education at an expensive private college, with all the amenities, including room, board, and pocket money. They didn't even blink, even though the sum probably ran into 100,000, maybe more. Maya studied marketing, or at least that's what her papers said, and then, as soon as she graduated, she got married and became a flawless housewife without having worked a day. All that expensive tuition for a photo in a white dress. I studied alone, without anyone's support. I applied for scholarships, wrote endless essays, worked part-time at night, and lived in a state of constant anxiety. When I was accepted to a state college with a full academic scholarship, my parents reacted with icy indifference, as if I'd told them I was going to the nearest supermarket. I immediately moved into a dorm, not out of ambition, but because I couldn't bear to breathe the air where every breath reminded me, "You're superfluous." School was tough. I went to classes, worked part-time at the university bookstore, ate instant noodles, and counted pennies, while Maya photographed her weekend at the beach. I sat under the lamp and rewrote my notes, feeling the world divided into those who receive help and those who save themselves. After graduation, I finally got a good job, at a marketing firm, and, surprisingly, for the first time in a long time, I felt as if the world had leveled out a bit. It was there that I met Jake, a man who saw me not through the prism of comparisons and family hierarchies, but as a woman to be listened to, respected, and loved. And in that moment, for the first time in my life, I understood what it was like to be seen. Jake and I had been together for 3 years, and during that time, Maya had become a mother of two and transformed into that radiant housewife from the advertising brochures, baking in the kitchen, a perfect smile, and lazy poolside gatherings where everything seemed to smell of vanilla and falsehood. Meanwhile, I was working, building a career, piecing together my life, proud of every success that had come not by inheritance or connections, but because I had suffered, learned, and earned it. And everything seemed to be coming together, finally, but Maya couldn't just let me be happy. No, she had to find a way to remind me who was always on the pedestal. Every time I mentioned Jake, she would stretch her lips into that habitual smile of hers, which always had a venomous note. "You're lucky, Lucinda," she'd say in that drawling voice usually reserved for compliments you want to hide from. "Lucky you managed to snag such a rich guy, you've really hit the jackpot." I saw my mother laugh in response, my father pretending not to hear, and I knew I was once again alone in the line of fire. I tried to answer calmly, not to give her the satisfaction of knowing I'd hurt her. "I'm not after rich guys, Maya. It all just happened," to which she'd merely purse her lips, narrowing her eyes slightly. "Of course, I just happened to meet a guy whose family has money. What an amazing coincidence." It was infuriating, because it wasn't like that at all. I didn't fall in love with Jake for the money. I had no idea back then that his family was well off. I fell in love with the way he laughed, the way he listened, the way he held my hand as if he were afraid to lose it, the way he said, "You know, Lucinda, everything is truly calm with you." He was kind, simple, sincere, and for the first time, with a man, I felt like I wasn't someone's shadow, not Maya's little sister, but a woman who was seen. But Maya had a different narrative for everyone. I was cunning, calculating, had arranged everything in advance. "You've always been smart," she'd say with a hint of mockery, "figuring out how to get by in life while others were working." Funny, right? This was coming from a woman who had never worked a day and whose parents had paid for her education down to the last dollar. But Maya always had a special gift, turning the narrative around so that you suddenly found yourself guilty, even if you were just breathing. Jake noticed how she treated me. He saw her make these caustic remarks during family dinners, and how my parents not only didn't stop her but laughed as if they were innocent jokes. After one particularly terrible evening, where she spent the entire dinner making comments like, "I wonder how much your dress cost." It was probably Jake's money. Jake pulled me aside, and I still remember him saying it quietly but firmly, "Your sister is jealous of you. She's had everything her whole life, and now she sees that you finally have something she doesn't have, and she can't handle it." I didn't want to believe it. I thought envy was low, that a sister couldn't do that, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized he was right. Maya was jealous, because for the first time in our lives, I had something she couldn't just take away, convince my parents to give it to her, or present as her own accomplishment, and apparently, that was what was driving her crazy. And then things got even stranger. One day, casually, at lunch with my parents, I mentioned that Jake's mother, Linda, owned several companies and was involved in investments. It wasn't meant as boasting. The conversation simply turned to work. I didn't even think much of it, but the word investments seemed to click in their heads. The very next Sunday, my father said with such an air of importance, as if he were making a government decision, "We think it's time you introduced us to Jake's mother, since you're so serious." Against my better judgment, I agreed. I guess I wanted them to see, at least once in their lives, what politeness and respect look like, and to understand that money doesn't elevate a person. Linda turned out to be an amazing woman, elegant, confident, and at the same time completely down to earth. She laughed when I told her how Jake and I argued about who should make coffee first in the morning, and she carried herself so casually that I even relaxed. But one look at my parents made my heart clench. They literally bombarded her with questions about companies, about income, about investments. My mother kept interjecting phrases like, "Aren't our girls both so goal-oriented?" And I saw Linda nod politely, but her eyes grew colder. My father, without hesitation, began talking about his business, his plans, and how the family business needed investment. I wanted to disappear into thin air. By the end of the evening, Linda, still polite and collected, said, "Send me your business plan, I'll take a look." I knew she was being polite, just to avoid embarrassing everyone, but a couple of weeks later, she actually contacted my father and offered to invest $50,000. When I learned of this, I felt uneasy, as if all the boundaries between my life and the old, family life, in which I'd always been second best, were crumbling again. When Jake proposed 6 months later, and both families finally gathered together to celebrate, everything seemed perfect. My parents were delighted. Linda, as always, offered to cover half the wedding costs, and I remember her smilingly telling me it was a small thing, because a day like this was worth all the effort. I, of course, agreed, but that's when something about the whole situation began to strike me as odd. Even then, I felt money begin to play a role I didn't quite like, and how easily my parents began to perceive it as something important, something that came first. After all, in our house, money had always been something almost sacred, something that entitles one to respect, to comfort, to status, and so they began persistently reminding me, "You have to pay your share of the wedding expenses, Lucinda, we'll pay you back later, don't worry." At that moment, I was so excited about wedding preparations that I didn't want to upset anyone, and I obediently agreed. Although I certainly didn't like it, I spent almost all my savings, about $15,000, on what I considered a temporary loan, just to get everything done and make the day special. While Jake and I were planning our wedding, my parents kept grumbling about how expensive everything was. "We need to save money on this, let's think about how to cut costs," Mom would say, completely ignoring the fact that Linda had already covered half the expenses, and meanwhile, Maya, of course, she couldn't stay away. She was constantly finding ways to interfere, to criticize my every decision, as if there was nothing else to do but make my wedding seem insignificant. Compared to her ideal, the roses at my wedding were amazing, she'd tell me with that same false inspiration that always underscored her attempts to be better than everyone else. "They were so much more beautiful than the ones you chose." I felt her words pierce me, eroding my sense of self, as if her criticism could overshadow my entire day, and at some point, I simply couldn't take it anymore and told her point blank, "Maya, please back off, it's my wedding." But I couldn't push her away forever. I knew she'd continue her comments, that she wouldn't be happy with any of my decisions. As always, she was looking for a weak spot to show everyone. Her life, her wedding, that's what was truly perfect. As I stood at the threshold of the hall, preparing to walk down the aisle, I heard her voice. "You know, my wedding was so much better than this one," she said with mild disdain, as if she were ready to destroy every ounce of happiness in me, and her words struck me right in the heart again. During the reception, it was the same story. "My wedding dress was so much prettier than yours," she hissed at me again as she passed, "and my bridesmaids were dressed so much better, those dresses look cheap," and I began to feel the warmth I'd tried to create around me fading with each of her remarks. She wandered from table to table, spreading rumors, arguing with relatives. The guests began to raise eyebrows, exchange glances, overhear her comments, and notice her odd behavior. I felt more and more people noticing how awkward she was acting at my wedding, how her envy and criticism were beginning to ruin the atmosphere. Maya was picky about everything. "The cake wasn't as good as mine," I heard her voice behind me as I tried to relax a little. "The band at your wedding isn't as talented as ours, and the music isn't the same either, and even the weather," it turned out, was worse than at hers. And though I tried to enjoy this important moment in my life, tried to forget all those critical words, Maya kept making herself known, like a hissing snake. I couldn't remain silent any longer, and at some point I felt tears welling up in my eyes. I almost burst into tears right there, in front of everyone, but then Jake came up to me, he hugged me, and I felt his warmth and support. "Don't pay attention to her," he whispered in my ear, "this is our day, not hers." His words were like a lifeline, like an anchor that kept me from drowning in her toxic criticism. But then came a moment when everyone froze. Linda stood up with a glass of champagne, and all eyes turned to her. She gave a wonderful speech about love, family, and new beginnings, and it was just as I'd imagined, sincere, without unnecessary words or pathos. But then she said something that shook everyone to their core. She said that as a wedding gift to Jake and me, she was giving the house on Maple Street, the whole house. I couldn't believe my ears, my heart fluttered, and I froze. I turned to Jake, and his face was just as stunned as mine. I looked at my parents, and their expressions were such that I could barely contain my laughter. They practically choked on their drinks in amazement. The smiles on everyone's faces instantly vanished, and a strange, awkward moment gripped the room. All the excitement evaporated in a second, and people began to quietly mutter, exchanging puzzled glances. I even heard someone in the corner ask, "What the hell just happened?" But the most powerful shock was on my parents' faces. My mother, hearing about the house, instantly jumped up and practically ran out of the reception area. I stood there, unable to comprehend what was happening, while behind her everyone began whispering, trying to figure out what was going on. My father, once again trying to hide his confusion, stood up and said loudly and tensely, "She just got emotional, pregnant. You know, it's all hormones, she just couldn't handle the excitement." Everyone nodded, as if this actually made any sense, but I could clearly see that they didn't believe him, that even they sensed that something was wrong. Who runs away from a wedding because someone suddenly receives such a luxurious gift as a house? I stood there for a long time, processing what was happening, unable to comprehend how all this had suddenly become part of my day, but no matter how hard I tried to suppress the wave of irritation, everything changed immediately. About 20 minutes later, I found myself in the bathroom, trying to cool off a bit, when suddenly a familiar voice came through the thin walls of the hallway, "Maya." At first, I didn't want to eavesdrop, but her words were too loud and frank to miss. "Lucinda is so arrogant," she was telling someone on the phone. "She thinks she's so much better than everyone else. She wanted to throw a better wedding than mine, but it didn't work out." I felt her words pierce me again. She couldn't believe that anything at this wedding could be beautiful or important unless it had something to do with her. Even after getting the house, she couldn't help but find a reason to undermine my happiness, my joy. But at that point I didn't care anymore. I had Jake, I had this new home, which, despite her snide remarks, was reality, not a mirage, and I could be happy. I decided I simply shouldn't indulge in her games and truly began to enjoy my new stage in life. When the reception ended and the guests began to leave, my parents ran up to me. Mom immediately grabbed my hand and, without ceremony, said, "Lucinda, we need to talk urgently." I felt the tension in her voice contagiously, but I answered firmly, "Not now, Mom, I can't. This was my day, this was my wedding, and now it was my honeymoon with Jake. We planned to go straight to the airport, and I absolutely wasn't going to let their drama ruin this moment." I glanced at Jake, and he was standing next to me, ready to support me. "But it's important," Dad insisted, as if this couldn't wait. I sighed but firmly replied, "It can wait." I took Jake's hand and calmly added, "We need to catch a plane," and without giving my parents any more chance to interfere, we left the reception and headed off on our honeymoon. Our honeymoon in Hawaii was absolutely amazing. I couldn't have imagined a better start to our life together with Jake. We spent 2 whole weeks enjoying each other, strolling along the beach, spending evenings in cozy restaurants where we didn't dwell on our problems, but made plans for the future, discussing how we would be in our new home. I forgot about all the troubles, even about my crazy family, who seemed to have left me alone, even though I knew perfectly well that sooner or later everything would return to me. But when we returned to the apartment, exhausted from the long flight, eager to unpack and maybe order a takeout pizza, we hadn't even had time to carry our suitcases into the apartment when there was a loud knock on the door. I opened it, and there stood my parents, their expressions so serious that I felt uneasy. They literally rushed past me without waiting for a greeting or even a brief welcome home. "We need to talk," my mother said immediately, as if we were living in some movie where there are always important moments that brook no delay. I tried to contain my irritation and find the strength within myself. "Can't we at least get settled first? We just got off the plane, but they weren't going to back down. This can't wait," my father continued, and I felt my blood begin to boil at their persistence. I sensed I probably wouldn't be able to avoid this conversation anyway, but at that moment, I was so unwilling to let my plans fall apart that, exhaling, I took Jake's hand again and said, "We'll talk later, when we have time." Now, in that moment, I knew that nothing was more important than being with him. When Dad started speaking, his voice was so confident and firm that for a moment I felt like I was in a courtroom, where an important decision was being made, a decision that affected everything I held dear. His words sounded like a verdict, like something that wasn't up for debate. "We've been thinking about this the whole time you were gone. We've made a decision about the house," he said, as if it had been said 1,000 times before, as if it were completely obvious to everyone but me. Mom, standing next to him, seemed to confirm his words, said it in a way that made me uneasy. "You need to give the house to Maya, she needs it more than you do." I stood there, speechless, and it took me a full minute to comprehend what they were saying, and when I finally gathered my strength and said, "Are you crazy?" my voice sounded unnaturally loud, as if I was trying to push away the nightmare. but it was too close, too real. Mom answered immediately, without slowing her steps, "We've already thought of that. Maya has 2 children and is pregnant with a third, she needs more space, you and Jake are young, you have good jobs, later, you can buy your own house." I couldn't believe she was saying that, hearing such words from my own parents. From the people I'd always considered my protection, my support, was like a punch in the face, my fingers clenched into fists, and I barely kept myself from screaming, "This is our home," I burst out, and my voice grew louder, filled with pain that still lingered. "Linda gave it to us, it's our wedding present. And you want me to explain this to Jake's mother as if family comes first for me?" I couldn't even imagine that now I would have to make such a terrible choice, and give up what was so dear to me for someone else, and they expected me to agree? Dad, as if nothing had happened, calmly continued, "We've already looked at the house, it's perfect for Maya's family. For the bedrooms, there's a large backyard where the kids could play." He spoke as if he were talking about buying new furniture, not about them trying to take away our happiness. I stood up, almost stumbling with grief, and, without holding back my emotions, exclaimed, "Wait. You came to our house and started deciding what would happen to it? Without asking us, without discussing how I needed it?" My father simply shrugged, without a trace of regret. "Before contacting you, we wanted to make sure it would suit Maya," he said, as if it were perfectly logical. I felt myself growing uneasy at their impudence, at the way they were walking through our house as if it wasn't my home, not our place. It was unacceptable. At that moment, Jake walked into the room. He was in the kitchen, and I could tell from his expression that he'd heard everything. "What's going on?" he asked, though his eyes said he'd already understood. Mom, as if we were all her property, answered, "We're explaining to Lucinda that she needs to give the house to her sister." I saw his face change, like the moment when the last barrier breaks, when a person finally decides to stand up for their beliefs. "You want us to give away our wedding gift?" Jake asked, as if he couldn't believe his ears. "Is that right?" he continued, his voice growing increasingly aggressive. Mom, ignoring his displeasure, said with a note of superiority, as if she and only she could decide such matters, "You must support this decision." And then Jake, perhaps feeling he couldn't keep silent any longer, suddenly looked at them as if they weren't my parents, but strangers he didn't recognize. Normal parents would never ask their daughter to do something like this. He said, his voice growing much louder. I felt something strange, powerful, but so necessary begin to pulse in my chest. It was that moment when I realized this man next to me wasn't just a husband, he was the one who stood by my side, who defended my interests, my right to happiness. That was important. But Dad, unwilling to back down, replied with cold determination, "Don't tell us how to raise children," and immediately added, "You're new to this family, and you need to understand how we work." These words sounded as if they were declaring that they had always had sole control over me and my decisions, and that everyone else was just newbies with no right to their own opinions. And then, right in the face of these words, Jake said with incredible calm determination, "If you don't leave our apartment right now, I'm calling the police." I had never heard him like that. His voice held the strength I always wanted to hear when I needed protection. My parents looked at me, expecting me to intervene, to tell Jake to calm down, but I simply stood there, silent. I had never felt such inner strength as in that moment, when someone had finally taken my side. My life with Jake was not just part of some grand plan. This was my place, my decisions, and now I didn't care what anyone thought. When they left, closing the door behind them, Mom said one last thing. "It's not over, Lucinda." I felt her voice linger with some last twitch, as if she hoped I'd return to her for advice or permission, but I didn't even think about that. I was simply horrified that my parents could do such a thing to the man I loved, the man with whom I was building a future. After they left, Jake and I just sat on the couch in silence. I was shaking with anger, disbelief, and the power they had over my life. Jake looked at me with a gentle expression and said, as if trying to defuse the tension, "I knew from what you told me that your parents were weird, but I never thought they were this crazy," and I felt support in his voice. A few hours later, as I sat on the couch, trying to come to terms with everything that had happened, the phone rang. I didn't pick it up right away, but when I saw the name on the screen, my heart sank. It was Linda. She was one of those people I could trust, but now, when her voice came through the phone, I felt something was wrong. "Hi, honey," she said, but her voice didn't have its usual warmth, it sounded confused, as if she couldn't figure out what was happening. "I just got the strangest call from your mother." I immediately felt a tightening inside, like something unbearably heavy was squeezing my chest. My heart sank, and thoughts raced through my head. They had managed to call Linda and lie to her. They said we had decided to give the house to Maya and had already agreed to it. I couldn't believe my ears, but when Linda continued, "She told me you always loved Mom so much that you decided to help her this way," I felt my soul literally break apart. What had they done? How could they? It was just a lie, and they sent it out into the world as if it were the truth. My heart sank even more, and my voice suddenly broke as I began to speak. "I never agreed to anything." I burst into tears right there on the phone. I simply couldn't hold it in. Tears streamed down my cheeks, and I tried to explain how it really happened, but the words wouldn't come. "Oh, darling, what's really going on?" Linda asked softly, and her voice, like a warm wind on a dark night, was the only comfort in that moment. I told her everything, about how my parents had ambushed us the moment we got home, how they'd started making demands, as if they were the ones making all the decisions and Jake and I were just spectators with no say in the matter. I told Linda how they'd already found the house and how they'd started looking at it without our permission. Everything was a jumbled mess in my head, like some kind of nightmare. I told them about how Maya, my sister, always got more, how my parents had favored her over me. It was unbearable, and now I couldn't hold back. Linda listened to everything without interrupting. I heard her silence in response, and then there was a pause that seemed like an eternity. When she finally spoke, her voice was firm, decisive. "Lucinda, dear, don't worry about this for a second," she said with such certainty that I felt the heaviness in my heart ease a little. "I'll handle this situation myself." I paused, unsure what she meant. "What do you mean?" I blurted out. Linda seemed not to have even heard the question. She continued, "Just trust me." There was a sharpness in her voice I'd never heard from her before. Linda, always gentle and kind, now spoke with such determination that I couldn't help but believe she was actually about to do something significant. "Your parents have made a very big mistake, and now they're going to learn the consequences of trying to manipulate my family." There was such power in her words that I froze for a moment. I felt her determination fill the room. Before I could even say anything, she continued, "You're my daughter-in-law now, and no one is allowed to interfere in my family's affairs. No one." It sounded like a vow, like a promise, and I felt incredibly grateful for her support. "Thank you," I whispered, unsure how to express my gratitude. "You don't need to thank me," she replied, and there was such confidence in her voice that I felt a little better. After I hung up, I told Jake that Linda was going to handle the situation. He didn't say much, only grimly muttered, "Okay," but I detected a cold determination in his voice. "Because your parents just made a very powerful enemy and have no idea what's in store for them." These words brought me out of my stupor, and I felt a deepening feeling in my chest that maybe we really could win. But despite this, part of me was still worried. We couldn't be sure how this would all end. It was a step into the unknown. 2 weeks passed. And in those days, I began to think that maybe they realized they'd crossed a line, maybe they'd gotten the hint and would now leave us alone. Jake and I were busy preparing to move into our new house, and for the first time in a long time, I began to feel truly happy. We had finally found our place, our new corner, and I began to believe that everything would work out. With this house came a new life, and I felt like our dreams with Jake were finally becoming reality. But even in this silence, in this expectation that all the problems were behind us, I couldn't forget how hard they had tried to destroy us. We weren't completely free yet, but with each day, with each step toward our home, I felt us growing stronger. That day when Linda called me, I almost didn't expect it to be another call that would change everything. I'd grown accustomed to her confident words, but today something in her voice made me wary, as if she herself were experiencing some kind of indescribable tension. "Lucinda, dear," she said, but there was something hard in her tone, something I couldn't help but notice. "I wanted to tell you what happened with your father's business." And as soon as she said it, I felt my temples tighten and my heart skip a beat, anticipating something terrible was about to happen. Linda continued, not giving me time to think. "Yesterday, I organized a meeting for investors. I told your father I was pulling all my money out of his company immediately and advised other investors to do the same." There was no tremor in her words, only steel and determination. My insides sank, she added, and I felt her words consume me completely. What did this mean? Why had she made this decision? And what would happen to our family business now? I could hardly breathe. Oh no, what did he say? I blurted out, even though I knew this conversation would not change anything. Linda didn't slow down. I explained to him in detail why I was leaving. I pictured it in my mind, her composure, her ruthless words, full of confidence. I told him I only invested in his company because you and Jake were in a serious relationship, and I wanted to support my future daughter-in-law's family. Linda's statement sounded like a death sentence. She had not only withdrawn the money, but also cut off any possible connection with his affairs, as if putting an end to something big and inevitable. And that was only the beginning. Linda's voice was calm, but I heard steel in it, she said, explaining to him how his business was incapable of making a profit, how it had barely broken even for 3 years. I heard her explain how only her investments and those of other investors kept the business alive. It was shocking. I couldn't believe he could have let his company get to this point. And Linda didn't hold back. The only reason his business survived is because of my investment and the investments of the other investors I brought in. She left no stone unturned in his self-righteousness and vanity. I asked, though I wasn't really sure I wanted to hear the answer, what else did you tell him? Linda didn't hesitate for a second. She left no illusions when she told him that he and my mother had been short-sighted, that they hadn't appreciated the good relationship our family could have had, that they had treated me poorly my entire life. I couldn't help but feel her words cut me, but at the same time, I was grateful she had finally told the truth. I also mentioned that they clearly hadn't thought about the future of your and Jake's children. I could see it all unfolding, how she was expressing everything that had been lingering in my mind for so long but I had never dared to say. And then, like a crashing waterfall, Linda added, I told him I would never, ever support their family again. That was the end. I imagined my father's face, his shocked eyes. When she said those words, I was sure he thought he could somehow charm her, find the words to change her mind, but Linda was as firm as a rock. She wouldn't back down. The other investors followed my example and pulled out their money too, she said, and I realized that this was the real turning point, the moment when everything changed. After that call, there was silence. I didn't hear from my parents for days, but I knew it couldn't go on forever. And then, just when I had calmed down a bit, the harassment began. My heart sank as I started receiving angry messages. My parents hadn't stopped their game. They started calling me, leaving abusive voicemails, accusing me of ruining my father's business and, of course, ruining the family. My mother didn't stop at just calling. She showed up at our apartment like a furious storm, screaming that I had to fix everything immediately. I couldn't even fathom how it was possible. She stormed into our house with such incredible aggression. You did this on purpose, she screamed, her voice full of hatred. You wanted revenge, and now you've got it. I felt something inside me break, but despite her screams, I didn't give in. I told her to leave or I'd call the police. When she continued screaming, I called them without hesitation. She left, but not before telling me that I was dead to her. It was a moment I will never forget, but my torment didn't end there. Maya joined in her mother's attacks, sending me text messages one after another, accusing me of ruining everything. She wrote that I was selfish, vindictive, that I had ruined her children's future just because I was jealous. She even called me a terrible sister and claimed I had always envied her. The messages grew more and more vicious, every word piercing my heart, every attack like the tip of a knife. When it all became unbearable, Jake intervened. He couldn't stand listening to another particularly vicious message from my father and said, "We'll hire a lawyer." He was right. We couldn't remain defenseless any longer, and the lawyer, sending them an official letter, informed my parents and Maya that their actions were illegal, and if they didn't stop, we would sue. We documented every insult, every threat, and a miracle happened. When they received that letter, the harassment stopped. There was silence, as if someone had flipped a switch, complete silence. Several months had passed since it all began. Things hadn't gotten any easier, but they certainly had become clearer. Jake and I had rebuilt our lives. We'd begun to truly appreciate peace and quiet. I felt the heavy, ominous shadows of my family receding more and more. And then, one day, I heard Linda's voice again. "Lucinda," she said, her tone soft yet wary, "I wanted to tell you what happened to your father's business." When those words came again, not the slightest thrill rose within me. It no longer bothered me the way it once had. I knew it was all predictable, even inevitable. She told me his company had gone bankrupt just a few weeks after all the investors, including Linda, had pulled out their money. He had to declare bankruptcy and sell most of his assets to pay off his debts, she said, and I felt neither pity nor relief, it was simply a fact, and I had anticipated the consequences. My parents were now living on their pensions and the few remaining savings they had. It was a reality that left me with no room for regret. They could no longer afford to support Mia's family. I couldn't even believe it when Linda added that Mia and her family had been forced to move to a much smaller apartment because they could no longer afford the luxurious living space my parents provided. Mia, this helpless and lazy woman who never worked, and whose husband didn't earn enough to support his family, was on the brink. All they had left was her husband's salary. When Linda told me that Maya had to give up her gym membership, weekly manicures, and other expensive pleasures, I felt no pity, not even a hint of sympathy. Yes, Maya was facing real hardship for the first time in her life, but didn't she deserve it? Didn't they all deserve it? And at the same time, I found it hard to believe how much my own world had changed. My parents, now deprived of what they considered their privilege, were forced to sell their large house and move into a small apartment. My father sold his expensive car and bought something old and used, and my mother could no longer even afford her weekly spa treatments. Yes, they were now facing reality. Like everyone else, but honestly, I didn't feel sorry for them. They themselves had created this mess, this endless drama. With their greed and manipulation, they tried to destroy me, depriving me of everything I ever had, and if they had simply been happy for me, for finally finding a good man and receiving a generous wedding gift, none of this would have happened. But no, they decided to do things their own way. They tried to take my house, just like they had taken everything else in my life. They lied to my mother-in-law, manipulated her, and tried to ruin my relationship with Jake, and now, after all of that, they're facing the consequences of their actions. Jake and I have been living in our house for over a year now, and it's been the happiest time of my life, without all those constant attacks, without their endless drama. We completely cut off contact with my family, and, my life became calm and, in a sense, brighter. There were no more insults, manipulations, daily torture with doubt, insecurity, the feeling that I wasn't good enough. I was no longer just an object for them to manipulate. Linda became what my parents never were. She became my true friend, mentor, and, you could say, my second mother. She not only accepted me for who I was, but also gave me the love and support that were so important to me. When Jake and I told her we were planning to have a baby, she was over the moon. This is how real parents react, those who are genuinely happy for their children and don't try to use them for their own gain. And so, when people ask me if I miss my family or if I'm worried about what happened to them, I, of course, answer honestly, no, I don't. I don't miss the stress, the manipulation, the endless attempts my parents made to make me feel inferior. I don't miss the days when I felt like I always had to please everyone, always be on top. No matter how they used me, my parents and Maya made their choice. They decided to spend my entire life treating me like trash, an object for manipulation. They decided they could take everything I valued from me, and that they could lie and manipulate me when they didn't get what they wanted. They decided to persecute us when we dared to stand up to them, and you know what? I chose myself, I chose my husband, my new family, and my happiness. I haven't regretted that decision for a single day. Some say family is everything, but I've learned the hard way that chosen family can be so much better than birth family. Jake and Linda showed me that true love and support are more important than any relationship with people who see you as just a tool to achieve their goals, and I won't let anyone use me anymore.